Power Plan. This is Ken Colburn at the Regulatory Assistance Project. I'll be your moderator today. I think that we're a minute or so past, so why don't I proceed ahead with the logistics and housekeeping for everyone, and then we'll start right in with the webinar. I wanted you to know that we're recording today's session, and a link will be sent to you following the webinar with the presentation materials and so forth. That'll probably go out tomorrow morning. We have more than 200 people registered for the call, so please keep your lines muted as we proceed, unless or until you have a question. Most questions we would ask you to type into your questions pane, then we'll forward them to the speakers. We can pause during the presentation for clarifying questions if anything on one of the slides or one of the statements is confusing, but generally we'll have a Q&A session after each of the speakers. We'll also plan to offer, the webinar will go from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, but there'll be a bonus session for questions and answers until 2:30 for those of you whose schedules permit you to stay on. With that, let me introduce the webinar briefly and then the speakers. The EPA has made clear that state clean energy programs, including those related to renewable energy, will be able to contribute to a state's clean power plan compliance. Renewable energy tracking systems will be a key element in helping states accomplish this. The Center for Resource Solutions and the Regulatory Assistance Project have collaborated to help you understand some of the ways that states are using renewable energy today and to appreciate how existing renewable energy compliance practices offer well-established and suitable approaches for regulators to use as part of their efforts to demonstrate compliance under the Clean Power Plan. We hope this webinar will be helpful as you work through these issues. Our first speaker today will be Jennifer Martin. Jennifer is the Executive Director of the nonprofit Center for Resource Solutions, CRS, where she brings over 2 decades of experience in renewable energy policy and market design. CRS's programs provide policy and market-oriented solutions to advance sustainable energy. Best known for its Green E certification program, CRS also works with the various REC tracking systems and state renewable energy programs, and it has supported the design and launch of many of the REC tracking systems in North America. Dave Farnsworth will be our second speaker. David is a Senior Associate at the Regulatory Assistance Project, and he advises regulators and advocates on clean energy and environmental policy and regulation. He supports the work of energy efficiency advocates around the country and environmental advocates on implementation of the U.S. EPA's Clean Power Program. Prior to joining RAP, David was a hearing officer and staff attorney with the Vermont Public Service Board, and from 2003 to 2008 served as a member of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, staff working group. I'll turn it over to you, Jennifer, to begin your remarks.
Thank you very much, Ken, for the introduction, and thank you to RAP for hosting this webinar. I wanted just to start with a quick overview of CRS for those who don't know us. We're a nonprofit organization, and we were founded in 1997, and as Ken stated in the introduction, we're involved in renewable energy and related climate policy issues. At the state level, we work with market participants and regulators and have been doing a lot of work on the intersection of renewable energy markets and greenhouse gas policies. We also run the annual Renewable Energy Markets Conference in collaboration with the U.S. EPA, and then of course we administer the Green E certification programs. Today we're focusing on the role of renewable energy in the Clean Power Plan. And I wanted, before we get deeper into the information that's in the reports we'll be going over, just to highlight a few key things about how renewable energy fits into the Clean Power Plan. I've excerpted here just a small bit of text from the draft plan that to emphasize a few key points. First, that EPA recognizes that emission reductions from renewable energy can be included in states' plans to meet their emission reduction targets. if that renewable energy is implemented by the state, and the state can include renewable energy that's a result of its programs, whether the renewable energy is within the state or in other states. And finally, that the EPA recognizes that renewable energy certificates are a mechanism to facilitate trading of renewable energy. So as we know, the majority of states across the country have implemented either RPS policies or renewable energy goals, and have been doing this for a number of years. The EPA the intent of the EPA seems to be that states' progress going forward in their RPS programs should be something that states could use to help facilitate meeting their goals in the Clean Power Plan. And as states have been rolling out these RPS programs over the last couple of decades, at the same time they've been developing renewable energy tracking systems to assist with the trading and tracking of renewable energy for their state program goals. Just briefly, what do these REC tracking systems provide to states? At a high level, the tracking systems are accounting systems for renewable energy. They create unique certificates with serial numbers for each megawatt hour of renewable energy that's generated within the footprint of the tracking system for registered generators. The certificates are the currency that the tracking system accounts for. Participants in tracking systems have accounts. Certificates can be transferred or traded between accounts by the participants in the tracking system. And when certificates are used, either for an RPS program, to show power source disclosure, or to substantiate a voluntary market renewable energy use, they can be retired in the tracking systems. And once they're retired, this is a permanent action and the certificate cannot be traded or used again. A really important aspect of how all the tracking systems are designed is that they are policy neutral. They're designed to provide a reliable, credible tracking and accounting system for renewable energy, but they track information, and that information can be used by program administrators like states with RPS programs, and in the future, states who have renewable energy programs that are being used to comply with their clean power plans. As we look forward to the states developing their compliance plans for EPA, there's several key things that tracking systems will be useful for as states move forward. They include documenting renewable energy production. The tracking systems have already shown over many years that they're very reliable sources for documenting high-quality information about the amount of renewable electricity that's generated. Tracking systems can be used to identify renewable energy generators and generation megawatt hours that are eligible for compliance with state plans. Tracking systems can also be used to verify the use of renewable energy for compliance with a specific state plan. So states will be able to use tracking systems to create reports that document renewable energy that could then be submitted to EPA to substantiate state achieving certain goals with regard to the renewable energy component of its state plan. One of the most important values that tracking systems will be able to provide to states is to assure that there's no double counting between states as they move forward with their compliance. The renewable energy component of the Clean Power Plan has this important characteristic in that it acknowledges that there's interstate trading of renewable energy. And so double counting between states is a serious risk for states that are going to use renewable energy as a key component of their Clean Power Plan compliance. By relying on tracking systems as the way to document the final use and application of renewable energy, states can have assurance that there won't be double counting of renewable energy when they're moving forward with their plans. And then finally, the tracking systems facilitate the interstate trading of renewable energy. Tracking systems are currently available to renewable energy generators across the United States. This map shows the different tracking systems that are currently in operation in the United States and Canada. For the states that show stripes or cross-hatching, that indicates that there are 2 different tracking systems that allow generators to register in those states. The reason for this is usually that, for example, in Missouri, RPS would require a generator to register in the North American Renewable Energy Registry, but generation in Missouri is also eligible for RPS compliance in other states, and those states may require those generators to register in MRETs. So there's a few places in the U.S. where these overlapping state requirements in tracking system geographies allow generators to register in different tracking systems, but no matter where a generator is, it's only allowed to register in one tracking system at a time, and the tracking systems cooperate to make sure that generators are only registered in one tracking system at any point in time. Something important to recognize about how renewable energy is traded now and how state policy is organized is that the vast majority, nearly all states that have RPS in place, allow renewable energy for their RPS policies that come from states other than the state itself. So only 4 states, well, 3 states plus Puerto Rico, do not allow renewable energy from outside the state. All the other states that have renewable portfolio standards allow renewable energy to meet their RPS from outside the borders of the state. So if states want to include their renewable portfolio standards as part of their compliance with the Clean Power Plan, it's going to be critical for them to be able to document ownership and use and no double counting of renewable energy from renewable energy that occurs in neighboring states. Many of the tracking systems that exist now have multi-state footprints, but even those footprints are being found to be not quite broad enough to facilitate the type of renewable energy trading that's starting to happen in the market now. As you can see from this diagram, many of the tracking systems have already started to cooperate to allow inter-registry transfer of renewable energy certificates, so that you can take a certificate that was created in Regis, for example, and export it into the North American Registry or the NC-RETS tracking system. Similarly, the MyREX tracking systems allows imports and exports from the MRET system. As states move forward with creating their Clean Power Plan compliance plans, they may find that they have need for even more inter-registry transfers in order to document the footprint of their renewable energy programs. And it will be important for states to work with the tracking systems to help develop the functionality they'll need to meet the requirements of their Clean Power Plan. This slide just shows the variety of information that can be tracked by tracking systems. This is the type of data that is typically tracked on a certificate. It includes information about the generator, its size, fuel type, name, location, the date the certificate was created, the age of the facility, whether or not it was repowered. And it will also include information about program eligibility. For example, are the RECs from this facility eligible for a specific state's RPS? The types of data that are tracked on certificates can be changed and augmented in the tracking systems. So as states move forward with developing their plans for compliance with the Clean Power Plan, and they find that they need renewable energy to have renewable energy certificates to contain other types of information that would be useful for them in demonstrating compliance, they can work with tracking systems to add that data so the tracking systems can track it and create reports for state administrators that will be useful to them. This is an example of a type of report that a tracking system could create now. It shows for a particular account holder, which could be an obligated entity, the number of certificates retired for a specific period of time. This report shows that this account holder created a sub-account called Renewable Energy Compliance for State X, and they made a number of retirements from several different generation facilities in order to comply with the RPS. And the report shows the facility's name, the month and year in which the certificates were created, the certificate serial numbers, as well as other information about whether or not those certificates are eligible for different types of state programs. Again, the tracking systems are flexible and they can create new reports that will be useful for states to demonstrate compliance with the renewable energy programs that they're going to be using to meet their emission reduction targets with the EPA. One thing that I wanted to leave everybody with is that it will be important for states that involve renewable energy in their state plans to demonstrate or require that REC retirement is needed for compliance with Clean Power Plan. If you don't require retirement of renewable energy certificates to document the progress of your state program, then you're leaving open the possibility that that renewable energy and those renewable energy certificates could be traded and used for another purpose. So REC retirement is what really supports states in making sure that there's no double counting and they have the sole claim to the renewable energy attributes and emission reductions resulting from renewable energy. So for next steps for states working with tracking systems is to start talking about what are the functionalities that states are going to need in order to support their compliance with EPA. There may be a need to add new certificate data and reporting functionality to meet state requirements. Also, the states may want to add specific information onto certificates. For example, the state may want to indicate whether or not a particular facility was a beneficiary of a specific state program that was designed for the purposes of the Clean Power Plan. States may also want to work with tracking systems to create or modify administrative access for state regulators. Right now, many of the tracking systems allow state regulators to have administrative access to the tracking system so that they can see information that's not publicly available to get a better sense of how compliance is going and what facilities or what obligated entities are doing to comply with current state requirements. And those things can be augmented to meet future state needs. And then finally, as states determine the footprint of the renewable energy activities that they will be using towards their Clean Power Plan compliance, they may have need for increased import and export functionality between the various tracking systems. So as states move forward in working with their neighbors and negotiating how renewable energy will be tracked and traded between regional areas, they may want to also enable certificates to be transferred and traded across those regions as well. I want to just summarize by putting up copies of the 3 reports that CRS and RAP have cooperated on preparing about tracking renewable energy and how it can be used for states in supporting states with their compliance with the Clean Power Plan. These reports are available on the CRS website and also at the Regulatory Assistance RAP's website. And with that, I'd be happy to follow up with other folks after the webinar, and then we do have time, I believe, right now for any clarifying questions on my presentation. And if there are no questions, then we'll be moving right on to Dave's presentation.
Thank you, Jennifer. This is Ken Colburn again at RAP. And as attendees can see on their screen, there's how to type in, or could see on your screen, how to type into the question pane. And Jennifer, we do have one question, and that was, could a single REC be used to simultaneously meet compliance obligations for both the state RPS requirement and the EPA's Clean Power Plan requirements?
It's our understanding from reading the draft rules that yes, that EPA intends that states can use their RPS programs as a tool to help meet the emission reduction goals in the Clean Power Plan. And so if a REC is retired for RPS and the RPS has been part of the state's proposal for how it's going to meet emission reductions, then they can demonstrate compliance, through REC retirement with the RPS, also to EPA.
Wonderful. We've had a second question come in, which may be sufficiently broad that we want to consider it after David's presentation, but leave it to you. Where do you see the future of RECs going? That may be, as I say, a broader one we should address in the open Q&A session. Why don't we defer that one, because actually a couple of other questions have arisen. One is, what with respect to additionality? Will EPA require additionality to be considered, and how would this impact tracking systems?
EPA doesn't address additionality specifically, especially if you're talking about it in the carbon offset sense, but they do want to see incremental emission reductions, and so states will have to demonstrate, new renewable energy, new energy efficiency, or new emission reductions as they move forward in meeting their goals.
Thank you, Jennifer. Another question, which I think may also be better served in our general Q&A, is asking for your thoughts on methods to document avoided generation. That may be a topic that bears more on energy efficiency than renewables, because there is renewable generation reflected in each REC. But I'll allow the questioner to, or you both, to elaborate further as we move beyond David's presentation. I think that's all the questions that we have at the moment. I'm sorry, one more. What about states that don't have RPSs or goals and currently? Will they need to join existing REC tracking systems if they want to purchase RECs for CPP compliance?
For states that don't have renewable energy programs in place right now, they have a lot of flexibility under the Clean Power Plan in putting forward how they plan to meet the emission reduction targets that their state has been assigned. If renewable energy is part of how they plan to meet their target, they will need to be able to document that they are, meeting their state plan goals with renewable energy. And I think the key message that we're giving in the webinar today is that the tracking systems that exist now provide a very useful and reliable tool that all states can use to document the use of renewable energy and as a result of state plans. So although I'm not, I don't know if EPA will require the use of tracking systems, I think as a state looking forward, you might, consider that tracking systems could be a very useful and reliable tool to you to be able to demonstrate that you're meeting the renewable energy component of your state plan.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well put. With that, why don't we then move to David Farnsworth from RAP. David?
Thank you, Ken. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you, and thank you, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everyone. This presentation, as Jennifer noted, is based on a recent paper that RAP has produced with CRS. So we're going to be able to go at these topics at a fairly high level, but we encourage you to go and use these resources to get down into more detail. This afternoon, I'll be considering several topics. First, what I see is a tension between the flexibility in EPA's proposal and the need to demonstrate compliance. And next, I'll be talking about potential issues related to using renewable energy as a compliance strategy with the Clean Power Plan. I really should emphasize that since nobody's seen the final rule, nobody really has the final say here. I'm working from what the proposed rule suggests, and that's about as clear as I can promise to be. For me, the genius of the Clean Power Plan is that it sets out to build upon what states are doing today. All the clean power investment that's happening at the state level, technology advances, clean energy trends. To me, this is a huge opportunity for states to take advantage of. In very stark terms, the simplest structure, so to speak, of 111D, it gives EPA some things to do, and it gives states some things they have to do. For EPA, they have to define the best system of emissions reduction. And states have to develop plans that are subject to EPA approval. When you look at EPA's definition of BSER, they've provided 4 building blocks. And that's obviously a very concrete way of thinking about potential solutions for states to work with. The term inside the fence is used to describe the sorts of appropriate approaches under the first building block. EPA determined that emissions of coal-fired steam electric generation units, EGUs, could be reduced through heat rate improvements. The other building blocks, 2, 3, and 4, are often characterized as outside of the fence solutions, and EPA has determined that emissions of all affected EGUs could be reduced, for example, by dispatching lower emitting natural gas combined cycle units more frequently, for example, or by adding renewables, or by adding and by retaining certain nuclear power generation in the portfolio, and also by reducing total demand through energy efficiency. So as I've noticed, there's a tension between the significant amounts of flexibility provided through the use of these building blocks. Also, there's flexibility in the ability for states to potentially comply through multi-state plans. In other words, getting together with their neighbors and developing approaches to compliance. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, is a model for this. Furthermore, there's flexibility with respect to even selective application of multi-state plans. States could engage in limited ways with their neighbors. The Western Interstate Energy Board and Provincial Steering Committee last fall came out with a proposal that's referred to as the Modular Approach to multi-state compliance. And so instead of going with a full tilt coordinated effort with your neighbor, like the RGGI states are doing, 2 states might get together and work on dispatch, or they might get together and work on renewables or efficiency proposals. So there's this selective approach that's there. So there's a significant amount of flexibility. I've only really scratched the surface here. And I think that balances, and states should recognize that all that flexibility is great, but that it balances with the need for precision in demonstrating compliance and meeting applicable criteria. So, and I've listed some of the criteria that are likely to apply here. So what I'd like to do is talk about how renewable energy can contribute to reducing CO2 emissions and how states can effectively represent how this might work. Yeah, just back one. So with respect to renewable energy, states will need to be able to make reasonable representations as to the emissions benefits associated with their renewable energy production. And if data are available, then regulators will need to understand that data in order to rely on it. If data are not available, then regulators are going to have to develop that data. With respect to avoided emissions, the 3 most common approaches are listed here. And the paper that I described at the beginning of this slide deck goes into detail. I'm not going to discuss those in detail, but there are various approaches for determining avoided emissions associated with renewable energy production. What I want to do right now is simply illustrate, many people don't quite get the idea of what it is that renewable energy is doing and why there are avoided energy benefits here. So I won't go into detail on the methodologies for determining this, but I want to illustrate very briefly what we mean when we say renewable energy produces emissions benefits. Looking at this figure here, assume you're an electric system planner at a traditional utility, or you're at an ISO and you're setting out a bid stack of generation to meet load. In this simple figure here, the task is to put together 3,000 megawatts of capacity. You assemble that using an older gas plant, newer gas, coal, nuclear power, and wind. And you can see that you put together 3,000 megawatts that you'll need to meet the load you're trying to serve. And you can do that for $50 a megawatt hour. However, now assume that 500 megawatts of wind becomes available. And you notice here that it fits in at the left side of the stack. It's less expensive. And so what it does is bump that marginal resource described here as old gas, leaving new gas on the margin. Now, the difference between the emissions from the old gas and the new gas resources, these avoided emissions, that is the emissions benefit. Notice that the marginal cost has been reduced, and probably the emissions as well, due to the displacement of older, less efficient gas plants. Remember also that depending on the region of the country, there could be a lot of CO2 or even more CO2 displaced by the incremental production of renewable energy. Marginal emissions in Wyoming are closer to 2,000 pounds, whereas in Connecticut, say in the Northeast, they might be close to half of that. Before we move on, I just wanted to recommend two resources that were produced by John Cheneau at RAP, my colleague there. They were produced for energy efficiency purposes, but they do apply in this context. They discuss how different approaches to articulating avoided emissions, and you may find this of value in your reading. So what I'd like to do now is shift gears a little bit and discuss how one might use renewable energy as part of the Clean Power Plan. To credit avoided emissions from renewable energy, states can rely on existing crediting mechanisms, or they can develop new ones. The REC systems are out there, as Jennifer described, and they track these certificates once they're sold and traded, and they're retired. They're retired in these systems to demonstrate compliance with various state policies. And so they're available for, in this Clean Power Plan context. There, I should emphasize this, and I will point it out a couple times. There's a need for a common methodology for characterizing and crediting emissions, but there are examples out there. Currently, for example, the state of Maine has an electricity disclosure requirement, as does the state of Delaware, and the New England Generation Information System and the PJM GAT system, respectively, are supporting those state policies. There's one additional flexibility feature of the Clean Power Plan that I didn't mention, and that is that EPA has allowed states to either develop rate-based or mass-based plans. Under a rate-based approach, the relevant EGU in the state would have to meet a pounds per megawatt goal, whereas under a mass-based approach, a state would have to demonstrate that the EGUs in the state in aggregate produce no more than a certain amount of emissions, typically described in terms of tons per year, for example. So how would a REC apply in a rate-based state? Well, the answer is fairly simply. It can be used to adjust the CO2 value in the numerator of a rate or the megawatt hour value in the denominator of a rate. And here's, in this illustration, I think hopefully clarify this. So assume a generator with a stack emissions rate of 1,500 pounds produces 1,000 megawatt hours. And then that 500 RECs determined to have an avoided CO2 value of 800 pounds are credited to the generator when calculating an adjusted CO2 emissions rate. Now, as the equation shows, the adjusted emissions rate is 1.5 million pounds minus 400,000 pounds credits divided by 1,000 megawatt hours, which equals an adjusted emissions rate of 1,100 pounds. That's the numerator. Focusing on the denominator, how might that calculation work? We'll take the same generator we've started with here, someone who produces 1,500 pounds of CO2 and 1,000 megawatt hours, and then apply 1,000 emissions-free megawatt hours that'll be credited to that generator when calculating the generator's adjusted CO2 emissions rate. And as the equation illustrates here, the adjusted emissions rate of 1.5 million pounds divided by 2,000 megawatt hours would equal an adjusted rate of 750 pounds. So that's a rate-based program. How about a mass-based program? How would RECs plug into that program? Well, for purposes of crediting renewable energy, a mass-based program, mass-based approach works very differently than a rate-based program. Because mass-based approaches capture all the emissions reductions that occur in covered plants, whatever the reason. In other words, a mass-based program, a state might meet its mass-based limits because of an RPS. RPS is in the region. The program may also meet goals because of energy efficiency or because of unusually cool summer or an unusually cold winter or a recession nationwide. There are many reasons that go into this. The mass-based program simply captures all the emission reductions, whatever the reason. So as far as Clean Power Plan compliance, there's no need to develop a crediting mechanism along the lines of what we were describing for rate-based programs. That's for Clean Power Plan compliance purposes. However, RECs and REC tracking systems still have a very strong role in RPS support, and they're still very useful, not only for RPSs, but for planning purposes. In other words, states are going to have to develop plans, and they're going to be able to use what they know about their RPS and the RECs that that are allowable under their state RPS in putting together a plan for demonstration to EPA that they can meet the Clean Power Plan requirements. Not only for planning purposes, but for regional trading once a Clean Power Plan, state plan is put into effect. So although the crediting works differently under a mass-based program, RECs and REC tracking systems still will be very valuable. Let's consider REC trading now, once a state program is up and running. First, REC trading out of a rate-based state should not really pose a problem, because RECs are an accepted means for making a claim about a renewable energy attribute, and it's the REC that's being traded. So if the REC leaves the rate-based state and is used for compliance elsewhere, it will be retired elsewhere and counted only once. It can't be counted in the state where the REC may have originated. REC trading out of a mass-based program, however, requires closer scrutiny. As I mentioned, it's very important to understand the way mass-based programs work. Renewable energy value is implicit in a state's emissions. So if a REC is traded out of a mass-based region, an adjustment to emissions reported or the emissions limit itself will be required in order for the mass-based program not to implicitly count the avoided emissions associated with that renewable generation, and also for the REC, which it may have traveled out of that region and traded somewhere else, for the REC not to be counted as well. So to avoid double counting, in other words. As I'm closing up here, I just want to make a few observations. And hopefully they tie in with the observations that Jennifer was making. You know, these systems, tracking systems and protocols have been used by industry and regulators in some parts of the country for nearly 20 years. Tracking systems and protocols used properly will help ensure reasonable compliance with Clean Power Plan requirements. REC ownership and retirement are established means for demonstrating regulatory compliance and any claims made about renewable energy. And there are reasonable means for determining avoided emissions associated with renewable energy production, and it's important that EPA provide guidance as to which of those are the most suitable. EPA guidance on that matter will be very helpful. Let me leave you just with one final thought. The point here is we've been trying to describe how tracking systems work and how they're a tool for states to use, just as they've used them for their renewables policies. States, we think, can use these tracking systems in their state plans for Clean Power Plan compliance. But we want to emphasize it's really the state plan that needs to be developed, and with an understanding of how these systems can help. Like I said, I want to leave you with one final thought. While RECs are used regionally, I would say that with 2 changes, RECs could be traded nationwide. First, as I've mentioned, EPA has to develop, provide common methodology for crediting avoided CO2 for all RECs. And the second change that would be needed would be to remove the deliverability requirement for purposes of Clean Power Plan compliance. And the deliverability requirement is that the requirement for RPSs that most states have, which is that the electrons associated with the project, with the megawatt hour from which a REC has been developed, that those electrons are deliverable into the area where the REC is being used. With these 2 changes, I would argue that RECs could be traded nationwide, creating a great means for states and to comply with the Clean Power Plan. Not only would RECs better reflect the amount of CO2 they displace, but the value and the utility of a REC would be improved, and arguably this would stimulate greater clean energy investment in parts of the country that have that are far more carbon intensive and could use that investment. Those are my prepared observations. I want to thank you for listening, and I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And again, you all see the screen about entering questions into the dialog box on your right-hand side control panel. David, we have received a question that relates to mass-based systems. Since a REC is not an offset, why is there concern about double counting in mass-based systems? The question goes on to say, given the interstate nature of the grid, how is it at all clear that wind in a given state displaces or reduces the output of a fossil resource co-located in the same state as the renewable energy plant?
That's a great question, and really a fundamental observation. I think the straightest answer is that if a REC is traded outside of a mass-based program and there's no adjustment by that mass-based program, that the REC explicitly will count somewhere else for Clean Power Plan purposes, and that the avoided emissions will be implicitly counted by the mass-based program. And consequently, you've created a double counting situation. Because mass-based programs don't need to articulate precisely where those avoided emissions come from, they are just all thrown in the hopper with any other reason for avoided emissions. And there's a good example in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative where, for the purposes of voluntary renewable marketing, the RGGI states, at least 8 of the 9 RGGI states, have agreed to integrate REC trading for voluntary renewables with the allowance attribute tracking system in that the RGGI states use to track tons of allowances. So what you're doing is connecting megawatt hours, the clean megawatt hours and the benefits there with the avoided emissions. And long and short of it is, for every ton of avoided emissions associated with renewable production, the RGGI states, these RGGI states I mentioned, will retire a ton of an allowance to make that adjustment.
Thank you, David. We have a couple of other questions that have come in as well. One is, again, a bit more general, and it's a question relating to recent state activities to roll back renewable portfolio standards or energy efficiency standards. And specifically, this question relates to Ohio, and whether you, and I think Jennifer could feel free to reply as well, believe there's a long-lasting chilling effect that may be caused by state legislative decisions like SB 310. I'm not familiar with the number, but I believe that was a rollback bill.
I can take some high-level comments first, Dave, and then please feel free to jump in. I think as states look at their current renewable energy portfolio standards, and I know this is going on in a few states where they're thinking, well, maybe we've achieved some of our goals. I think a lot, those discussions would benefit by integrating, looking at, how the state plans to meet its compliance goals under the Clean Power Plan, and the importance of being able to demonstrate, state program responsibility for emission reductions from renewable energy. And I would be, a little concerned for states that roll back their RPSs and then perhaps lose the ability to be able to document the impacts of state programs on reducing emissions in the electricity grid through renewable energy.
I would agree with what Jennifer said, Ken. From a narrow perspective, Clean Power Plan compliance, it sounds like states that are dissolving RPSs are taking solutions off the table. That may not necessarily be bad, but it doesn't sound good to me. What are the costs of solutions are questions that states should be asking. What are the choices I have? What are they going to cost? What are the timelines for investment to get these solutions implemented and online? These are the questions that states should be asking, and renewables probably are going to are probably going to have a role there. So taking renewables off the table without asking those questions first, I think I wouldn't recommend doing that.
It's not a time to be removing options from the table. In other words, better to be adding them at this point of uncertainty. David, another question that relates perhaps more to your presentation, but again, I'd invite reflections from Jennifer as well. It relates to nuclear energy and hydro, other forms of zero-emission electricity, and how will they be treated? Would one incremental nuclear energy credit or hydro credit be analogous to a REC? How are those zero-emitting resources going to be bundled in the suite of same suite of tools as renewable energy? But presumably they wouldn't qualify for RECs per se.
Yeah, that's a great question. And part of this discussion is the discussion that's gone on in states that have decided whether or not to include these resources in their renewable policies, whether they be feed-in tariffs or RPSs. So I think that's a discussion that states would need to have, and states in putting together a plan would need to think about. The EPA's proposal, I think it's in Building Block 3, talks about at-risk nuclear power and nuclear power that will have come online ahead of the implementation of this program. So there's some limited amount of nuclear power there. But I think one could talk more broadly about including that. It's a discussion states would need to have. Do they want to include only incremental nuclear power, incremental hydro production, in other words, uprates from nukes, or brand new nuclear power plants? It's really, the reason I want to emphasize it's a discussion that states need to have is because there's so many political dimensions to this that I can't do more than just make that observation. However, once states do develop a policy that does include those resources, for example, then those could be included in and tracked in a tracking system like any other resource. They're resources that can be metered. You can count a megawatt hour. You can count where you can put together a certificate just as one does for a wind plant or a wind project or a solar project, and put all the particulars in there. And If states have decided they want to go that way, then they turn around and ask themselves, will EPA find this resource to be a suitable resource as part of my portfolio to comply with the Clean Power Plan? That would be the next question. But from just a technical standpoint, there's no reason why those resources can't be tracked like any other resource by these existing tracking systems that are in place around the country.
Thank you, David. And another hydro-related question while we're on that topic, what about legacy hydro? Any ideas how that'll be treated under the Clean Power Plan? Most state RPS does not include legacy hydro, but the thought goes on to ask, would states in the Pacific Northwest, for example, be better off using the mass-based approach to demonstrate compliance because they have tremendous hydro and low fossil generation at present?
You know, Ken, a pretty complicated question. I would observe that in establishing states' rates, EPA will have, to varying degrees, and I'm just not sure of the particulars, considered the degree to which existing hydro is already in that state's mix, and to what degree their rate consequently would reflect that. I suspect that changes all over the state, all over the country. As far as a solution, a compliance solution, I think the states would have to make an argument that their use of a hydro resource should be included because it improves upon whatever baseline they're starting with, and I think states would have to make that argument.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. A broader question, does one way of solving the problem of relating to double counting come down to allowing RECs to be traded nationwide, much as you alluded, David? Then presumably there would be less double counting, if any, but perhaps for the consideration of the mass-based programs.
I'll take a first shot at responding to that
Please,
question,
yeah.
and then Dave, feel free to jump in as well. The key thing for the Clean Power Plan is that each state or states, if they're cooperating as a region, need to put forward a plan to EPA about how they plan to create the emission reductions that are required under the plan. And so with renewable energy, a state will need to put an argument forward to EPA about how actions they're taking are resulting in emission reductions created by renewable energy. Renewable energy certificates offer a way for states to be able to account for how much of that renewable energy was created and to demonstrate that it was retired on behalf or supporting of the state plan. It can be that the state's actions create renewable energy, renewable energy emission reductions far from the state, perhaps many states away, but they need to be able to have a story to tell in their state plan about how their actions created that renewable energy and how it created emission reductions. I think in that case, you could certainly have a REC retired from a distant location and be able to use it as support for meeting your emission reductions goals in a state, but you'd need to still be able to demonstrate how the state's activities were causal in the creation of that renewable energy.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm sensitive to the fact that our 2 o'clock time frame is coming near an end, so let me turn back to first the general question that we heard earlier about where do we see RECs going generally. The REC markets, the development of RECs, the use of RECs. What is the Clean Power Plan likely to generate in that regard?
Well, I can start off with some high-level remarks and be very interested to hear Dave's as well. Right now, RECs are the basic currency that are used to trade renewable energy all across the country. Every renewable energy generator that signs a contract to sell its electricity, the contract will be explicit about the RECs and the environmental attributes and whether those are going to the power purchaser or they're being sold to another entity. And the tracking systems are used by states with state programs and also the voluntary market to track ownership of renewable energy. So right now I would say, RECs are the de facto currency of renewable energy trading in the U.S. With the Clean Power Plan, as Dave has emphasized, states have a lot of flexibility about how they put forward programs to meet their emission reduction goals. We're recommending in a report presentation that states rely on tracking systems for an accounting mechanism for renewable energy. The degree to which states incorporate renewable energy into their Clean Power Plan goals, we don't know that. It could be a lot of states push forward on renewable energy policies more aggressively moving forward, and that increases the trading of renewable energy and the use of renewable energy certificates to document that trading and retirement. But it could be, a lot of states decide that they're going to use other policy tools and that the Clean Power Plan isn't a big driver for new renewable energy developed and increased REC use. I would expect that with the flexibility that EPA has given to the states, that there are going to be a variety of approaches that states use, and that certainly in some regions, renewable energy certificates, there'll be increased activity with renewable energy certificates as states rely increasingly on renewable energy as a mechanism to reduce emissions on the grid.
Thank you, Jennifer.
I agree with what Jennifer said. I think she's absolutely correct. I would sort of just step back a second and emphasize to the listeners that these tracking systems track attributes. And so far in the last 12 or 15 years, the game has been renewables. And the action has all been on renewables. Consequently, the emphasis and just the common parlance is RECs. But these certificates track attributes. And for instance, in New England, in New York ISO and PJM, those systems track attributes of all generation, not just renewables. So I just want to emphasize that when we think about where REC systems are going, I think the sky's the limit because they can track any generator attribute. In going back to Jennifer's prior remarks, the concern about double counting, there shouldn't be any concern about double counting if states were to follow tracking system rules and trading rules. As far as retirement, there's double counting of instruments, and that just doesn't need to happen because rules are put into place and practices have been there for years to ensure that. The concern, I would say, is for double counting, and this is where EPA's guidance is so important, is the emissions associated with the underlying creation of that certificate in the first place. Where that gets standardized across the U.S., then you're going to really avoid the concern about double counting. And RECs can serve as a commodity and a means of trading that can work anywhere in the country. The Jennifer's paper, one of the 3 papers she puts up, talks about things that tracking systems around the country will need to do to be able to essentially to talk with each other, and those sorts of solutions are fairly minor. There's that capacity out there. Folks know how to use them. Industry knows how to use it. Regulators have been relying on it for a long time, and it presents a great platform with which states can build and develop plans.
Thank you, David. We have a number of other good questions, and the presenters will be with us until 2:30, but for those of you whose schedule doesn't permit you to stay with us, I wanted to turn back to Jennifer for just a moment to offer a few summarizing thoughts, and then we'll continue on through 2:30.
Right. Thank you, Ken. So the questions we've just been going through have led us through a lot of different scenarios and issues that may arise with the Clean Power Plan, but I did want to go back and just review some of the key points that Dave and I have tried to emphasize in our presentations, which is that, as Dave was just talking about, assuring that there is no double counting of emission reductions from renewable energy as states move forward with their state plans. It's going to be an important component of any renewable energy programs you put forward. And as we've shown, tracking systems that exist now are very reliable, highly credible tools that states can use in order to protect against double counting and be able to document the use of renewable energy as in their state or as a result of their state programs. The tracking systems that exist now are designed to be policy neutral, which means they have the flexibility to add functionality and reporting functions that states can use as they move forward with deciding what they're going to be able to need in order to demonstrate compliance with their state programs. As Dave discussed, the tracking systems have a role to play in both rate-based and mass-based reporting. For rate-based, there's EPA has suggested 2 different ways that renewable energy can be used to adjust your emissions if you're doing rate-based reporting. And with mass-based reporting, if states want to continue to use renewable energy from outside their state boundaries, it's going to be important to be able to document that renewable energy and to have states agree how masses will be adjusted if renewable energy is imported or exported to the state. Without being able to do that accounting, with tracking systems, there's very limited ability for mass-based states to be able to use renewable energy from out of state or export renewable energy from their state to a neighboring state. Tracking systems are going to be very important as states move forward. Since most of the RPS programs are interstate in nature, tracking systems provide the foundation for states to be able to track what renewable energy they can count in their state plans. And with that, I'd like to also see if Dave has any concluding remarks, and then I guess we'll go back to Q&A.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think you covered the waterfront really nicely.
Wonderful. Well, then I as the moderator, Ken Colburn at RAP, would like to thank all the participants and encourage as many of you who can to stay on with us, and appreciate those who can't as well. Moving on then, Jennifer and David, to some of the additional questions that we've received. One, I mentioned efficiency earlier, and one of our questioners is asking, are the REC tracking entities like Regis or MRETS or GATS and PJM currently working to add information associated with avoided emissions to the attributes on RECs? Are these entities considering developing tracking systems for energy efficiency generally as well?
I'll take a first shot, Dave, and please jump in if you have other information. I know that many of the tracking systems right now are looking at how they can serve the needs of states as they move forward with compliance with the Clean Power Plan. And I've certainly heard many discussions of tracking systems, asking the question, well, should we add information on the certificate about avoided emissions? It would be very easy for tracking systems to do this. As Dave mentioned in his presentation, the bigger issue is how do you do it? There's several different approaches for estimating or calculating avoided emissions from renewable energy. And in order for tracking systems to include that information, they would need to get instructions from the state about how the state wants to report it to EPA. But there's certainly the capability to measure that.
I agree with that. I would just observe that in PJM, for example, in the New England GIS system, there's the capacity in those systems to include, along with all the generator information, Jennifer had a slide that showed that, continuous emissions monitoring data that is currently being gathered by the EPA. Now, I say there's the capacity to do that. That would need to be collected, and quality control would need to be applied to that to make sure the data is correct. But there's that capacity in those systems today, and I think what's most encouraging, as Jennifer pointed out, that states are thinking about doing that, and tracking systems rather are thinking about doing that now and exploring this. And I think Clean Power Plan compliance is going to be a very strong, encouraging signal for tracking systems to go ahead and follow through with that.
Wonderful.
The second part of that question was about energy efficiency. The New England GIS tracking system does track energy efficiency certificates for one of the state programs in its footprint. And I know that some of the other tracking systems are beginning to ask their state regulators and state stakeholders if tracking energy efficiency in the tracking system would be helpful to them. There's also people asking if a new tracking system needs to be created for energy efficiency. So that question is, is being actively discussed in a variety of forums right now. The one thing I would point out is that in the Clean Power Plan, while interstate trading of renewable energy is recognized, interstate trading of energy efficiency derived emission reductions is not. So while states may want to document energy efficiency results from their state programs, there's not a need, at least within the plan as it stands now, to create systems that would allow trading of those energy efficiency reductions across state boundaries.
And thank you, Jennifer. And speaking of documentation, an earlier question also concerned documentation of avoided generation. That too may be different in the context of RECs and renewables generally than efficiency. But did you have any thoughts on that? The question wasn't more specific. Any advice or perspectives on documenting the avoided generation?
Well, I'll just, again, point to some of the discussion that Dave brought up in his presentation, that there are several different ways you could approach calculating or estimating the emission reductions from avoided generation that's the result of renewable energy. And depending on if you're doing mass-based or rate-based reporting, you have different needs for these. With rate-based reporting, one method, adjusting the tons, would require states to know the tons of emissions avoided due to renewable energy. If the states took the other approach, which would be to adjust the denominator, the megawatt hours number, then states wouldn't need to know the specific amount of tons avoided on the grid. They would just be able to adjust their average rate by the amount of renewable energy that they achieved through their state plan. With mass-based programs, if, as Dave pointed out, states just need to report their total emissions, and so the only reason they would need to have adjustments based on avoided emissions is if they're going to allow renewable energy trading across state boundaries, or as California has done, and all of the RGGI states except for one have done with the existing cap and trade programs, if they're going to have allowance set-aside programs for the voluntary market or for any other purposes where they want to adjust the caps as a result of renewable energy activity in their state.
Thank you. I would note that one of our participants today from North Carolina also wrote in and indicated that North Carolina also tracks efficiency in its system. A further question relates to if a state has an RPS requirement, in addition to retail supply or voluntary REC products, can RECs that are in excess of the state's RPS requirements be counted towards CPP compliance for the state, assuming, of course, that such RECs were retired in their RTO or balancing area?
Well, I'll start again by just reminding everybody that I, don't know what EPA will do eventually when they come out with their final rule. But my interpretation of the rule as it stands right now is that states will be able to count renewable energy towards compliance if it's the result of state activity that is part of the state plan. And so RPS programs are programs implemented by the state, and I think it would be pretty clear-cut for the state to be able to demonstrate that their RPS policy resulted in renewable energy, that resulted in emission reductions, and to use that as part of their state plan for meeting their compliance with the Clean Power Plan. Voluntary renewable energy is not, necessarily a state activity, so I would raise a question about whether or not it was something that EPA would consider for compliance purposes, since it's not the result of, a state regulatory program. And then just based on history so far, if you look at the regions of the country that have cap-and-trade programs in place right now, so the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast, and also California's cap-and-trade program, in both of those programs, voluntary renewable energy activity has been taken out of the cap. So both of those regions have adopted set-aside programs where the emissions impacts of the voluntary renewable energy activity in those states has been effectively taken out of the cap by providing allowances retirements that are matched to the voluntary renewable energy activity in the states. And so if precedent is in any measure, the consensus so far has been that voluntary renewable energy activity should be outside of what's used for compliance with a mandatory greenhouse gas program.
And one might add also that, of course, the RECs would have to be retired in the state or by a source associated with the state, as opposed to sold outside.
Yeah.
David, did you want to add anything to Jennifer's remarks?
No, thank you, Ken. I think Jennifer did a great job explaining that. Voluntary programs, by definition, are programs that go beyond regulatory requirements, that allow people to take extraordinary efforts to further these clean energy goals, and to simply subsume them into state requirements I think misses that point. And Jennifer talked about how the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative it sort of goes out of its way to retire allowances to reflect this extraordinary effort, this beyond regulatory effort by individuals who invest in renewables in that manner. And I think, like she said, it's a great precedent. It's a fairly simple action that requires a huge footnote to explain, but I think it's important if states want to continue to promote this voluntary efforts on top of these regulatory programs we're talking about.
Thanks, David. We have a couple other questions that are macro in nature, but while we're in this vein, let me ask a few that more relate directly. And one I think you generally addressed, Jennifer and David, but let's be crystal clear. How definite are we that EPA will allow states to use RECs for compliance with the CPP?
Well, short of getting out my tea leaves, I can't answer that with certainty. The current, draft plan that's out there recognizes RECs several times, and EPA is clear that RECs are a way of trading renewable energy attributes. There's also, other federal, statements and rules, including from the FTC, that emphasize the role of RECs in trading renewable energy and renewable energy attributes. And then, among states, there's, a plethora of regulatory law and contracts and market institutions in place that all use RECs in this way. So I would be surprised if EPA were to not allow RECs as a way of demonstrating the transfer of renewable energy and the emissions benefits of renewable energy.
Thank you, David.
I don't have anything to add. Only tea leaves. This is the way that states currently use RECs for regulatory compliance is the obvious way that states might continue using RECs for regulatory compliance under this federal program. To wipe that approach out and develop one out of whole cloth is not impossible, but it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So I would find it pretty surprising if these established regulatory patterns and these established protocols and these systems that have been around for a long time are just ignored for some other approach.
Thank you. And just to add a finer point on that, that was a theoretical threshold question. What about out-of-state RECs that are settled in-state or in your state RTO, the RTO serving your state? Will they qualify for compliance, even though they weren't generated, that renewable energy wasn't generated in your state?
Yeah, well, the draft plan that's out right now is clear that renewable energy from outside the state can be used by the state to show progress towards its emission reduction goals. The state will need to be able to show that that renewable energy should be attributable to them. With rate-based reporting, it's pretty clear how states can do that. They can just show that renewable energy was, retired, used towards their state program and their plan, and then use those megawatt hours or those emission reductions to adjust their rate. With mass-based reporting, states will need to be able, they'll need to have agreements with their neighbors about accounting for renewable energy if they want to use renewable energy from out of state.
Ken, I would observe that CO2 is a little different. It's a little different from some of the other pollutants that might be avoided by the production of renewable energy. CO2 is ubiquitous. It goes anywhere in the atmosphere. It's persistent, far more persistent than many of the other sort of pollutants like NOx and SOx that have arguably more regional or more local effects. Certainly mercury, which was once considered for a cap and trade type approach. I would think that that there would be certain logic to. It strikes me as more acceptable to be willing to go a little further afield and to accept renewable projects from a greater distance from where ultimately a REC might be used for compliance on the basis of that difference between CO2 and other pollutants.
David, without knowing it, you've segued to the next question. We understand there are 4 or 5 projects to bring additional Canadian hydro into the country. How will incremental Canadian hydro be tracked and treated? Any thoughts on that?
I know that so there's an RPS discussion going on in Vermont, and Canadian hydro is part of that discussion. As I mentioned earlier, like any other resource, if you can meter it, in other words, if you can count each megawatt hour of production associated with it, if you can isolate the generator and the specific attributes of that generator, those things can all go into a tracking system in the form of a certificate, and one certificate for each megawatt hour produced with those attributes, and the rest is whatever the state chooses for a policy.
Jennifer, any thoughts on that as well?
No, I mean, I think it's going to be up to the states to make a case to EPA that not just out of state but out of country renewable energy imports are a result of a state plan and are contributing to emission reductions in the state.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We had another question related to our voluntary discussion earlier, and that's, do you think that the CPP will essentially deplete the market for voluntary participants? Will it buy up all the RECs and leave relatively few for those who are perhaps even not regulated but interested in RECs for their own voluntary market claims or other reasons?
I think that's a very interesting question, and unfortunately I don't have a strong answer for it. Haven't seen any analysis yet looking at the potential increase in demand for renewable energy as a result of the CPP compared to what we expect, renewable energy build out to be, looking forward, through the 2020 period and out into the future. So I haven't, heard people saying, oh, there's going to be, dramatic shortages of renewable energy, but I also have not, seen any really good comprehensive studies yet that would be able, that would form basis for me to be able to say that there's going to be, shortages or very high prices of RECs in the future.
Mm-hmm. David, anything to add? Okay. An interesting question about RECs, REC purchasing by or within states that don't have RPSs. We normally think of REC purchases to meet an RPS, but would we surmise that states or entities in states could purchase RECs from out of state even though their state, the domestic state, does not have an RPS, and use those toward compliance with the CPP?
Again, I think it all boils down to the state plan. It's pretty clear in the existing draft regulation that EPA wants states to put forward a policy plan about how renewable energy will help meet the emission reduction targets in the Clean Power Plan. And if an obligated entity can demonstrate that their purchase of renewable energy certificates is and the state can demonstrate that it's a result of the state policy measures, then it doesn't have to be an RPS that you use. I'm sure that there are other mechanisms that states will come up with the flexibility in the Clean Power Plan to be able to demonstrate advances in renewable energy that they may be RPS or they may be other kinds of policy tools.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. There were a couple of other more broad questions that might not be directly with respect to RECs, but bear on the issue. Certainly one was, do we know of any other states that are considering requiring storage to pair with renewables and their variability, and whether or not we can cite individual states, what do we see as that future as well, looking forward?
I'm happy to jump in there. I think that's a great question. I'd sort of consider that question even more broadly. In other words, I think implicit in that question is that renewables are intermittent, and there are most renewables are intermittent, but not all. The assumption is that renewables are intermittent. Consequently, it's going to require some other resources to help the system accommodate this increase in resources, and that's a whole other discussion. I think every time I hear somebody point out that renewables are intermittent, therefore beware, I think it's more helpful to think about how the system as we know it today is not particularly flexible, and that it needs to become more flexible, because there are all these opportunities not just for cleaner resources, but for less expensive resources, less risky financially, from a health perspective, from a climate perspective, less risky resources that the system has to accommodate and has to become more flexible to accommodate.
Thank you. Thanks. Jennifer, did you want to add anything?
No, I think Dave covered it well.
Okay, great. Well then, another macro question was with respect to, was raised concerning Severin Bornstein and some of the folks at UC Berkeley, and they're suggesting apparently that utility scale renewable energy may be a faster way to reduce carbon emissions, particularly on the solar side, of course, than through rooftops on the consumer or DG level. And those, of course, are often driven by marketing messages by the leasing and other companies that are in the marketplace driving that subsector. In light of death spiral types of concerns about utilities or at utilities, is utility scale solar perhaps something that EPA should push for disproportionately to encourage utilities transition to solar rather than entrance into a death spiral?
Ken, I don't think that EPA has to push for a specific approach here necessarily. I would observe that investors love certainty. So if you know that there's a clean power program and states have certain goals to meet that could include clean power as part of the solutions, that's a good signal. And it may be that larger projects, utility scale projects, are just the thing, you know. But there are also examples of the state of Maine, for example. The legislature there is looking at a solar aggregation approach, where it might be one of the incumbent utilities that takes on the role of aggregator and aggregates all these distributed solar, rooftop solar programs in a way that makes selling their output a little less unwieldy to the market, to the wholesale market. And so I think there are lots of roads to Damascus, you know what I mean? And I think it doesn't make sense to preclude different routes. I think the most important thing is creating a strong signal that there's a positive investment climate for these type of resources. As far as the death spiral goes, you know, utilities shouldn't be talking about that, shouldn't be using that metaphor with a straight face. Let's put it that way. There are all sorts of opportunities for electrification, light transportation, electric cars, electrification for buildings that just present huge opportunities for utilities to not simply shrink away from, or to characterize the market as shrinking, let's put it that way. But there are all sorts of opportunities for much greater use of electricity, and to the degree we get it cleaned up, people should be using more of it.
Thank you, David. Jennifer, go ahead.
I agree with Dave's remarks, and I just wanted to add about solar that, you know, as with any kind of technology, it's important for states to pay attention to the ownership of the renewable energy certificates from solar facilities. And so whether, you know, a state or obligated entities are pursuing utility scale solar or lots of smaller distributed solar, it's still going to be important to track the renewable energy certificates, the environmental attributes from those facilities, and assure that if they're going to be used for compliance, that they're retired in a tracking system, and it's clear that they're retired by an entity that's applying them towards the state's goals for a clean power plan. Many companies have invested, you know, voluntarily in solar energy, especially distributed solar, for the purpose of addressing their own carbon footprint, and they're, you know, wanting to use renewable energy for their own use. So we would, you know, qualify these kinds of uses of solar as voluntary. And as we discussed earlier, it's been the precedent so far with greenhouse gas regulation in the country, both in the U.S. and California, not to count these kinds of facilities towards greenhouse gas emissions or state compliance with state programs.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I have one other question, and that just concerned whether speakers' presentations would be available. And as we roll into the last 10 seconds of our allotted time, let me field that one by saying yes, a recording of the webinar and the speakers' presentations will be available on RAP's website. We will send that to all of the registered participants by email tomorrow, the link for that. And I just want to close by thanking our presenters, Jennifer Martin of CRS and Dave Farnsworth from RAP, and thanking all our participants for their interest in joining in today's webinar. Thanks very much.